Alessandro Carrera, my old friend since the years in which I was visiting at the Pontifical Institute in Toronto. Carrera was at that time teaching in Canada, in a university close to Toronto. This evening, Professor Carrera will speak about Leopardi. I give just a brief note on his work. Alessandro Carrera is a professor of Italian studies at the University of Houston. His publications are in the fields of continental philosophy, Italian and comparative literature, literary theory, film studies, and music, classical and popular. As a Leopardi scholar, he has edited Giacomo Leopardi, Poeta e Filosofo, 1998. He has published La distanza del cielo, Leopardi e lo spazio dell'ispirazione, 2011, and the article The Consistency of Nothingness, Leopardi's Struggle with the Solido Nulla, 2013. Two more articles on Leopardi are forthcoming. Alessandro Carrera has a philosophical background in phenomenology, hermeneutics, and aesthetics of music. His philosophical work, in constant relationship with literature, music, and the arts, includes L'esperienza dell'istante, 1995, Lo spazio materno dell'ispirazione, 2004, La consistenza del passato, 2007, and La consistenza della luce, Feltrinelli, 2010. He has also edited the English version of works by contemporary Italian philosophers such as Massimo Cacciari, Emanuele Severino, and Carlo Sini, his maestro in Milan. He has explored several areas of music, from German expressionism to the Italian avant-garde of the 50s and 60s. In this book, Filosofia del Minimalismo, is forthcoming in 2018. He has also written on Italian folk music and on the tradition of American song embodied in the work of Bob Dylan. Carrera is the author of La voce di Bob Dylan, Una spiegazione dell'America, Feltrinelli, 2001 and 2011. It has translated Bob Dylan's prose works and songs for Italian publisher Feltrinelli. In the field of film studies, he has published an article on the sublime in Roberto Rossellini. He has just completed the book on paganism and Christianity in the films of Federico Fellini, Bloomsbury, 2018. Professor Carrera will speak this evening on I Can't Get No Satisfaction, Giacomo Leopardi's Theory of Infinite Desire. Please join me to welcome Professor Alessandro.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope the microphone is working. You will tell me. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Maria Luisa, and all of you for being here. You cannot imagine how happy I am, because it was 17 years ago that I was teaching in this very room, and I've always been happy to come back here. Yeah, Maria Luisa said that my book on Fellini is completed. When I sent the notice, I thought that I would be able to complete it last night, but it wasn't so. I still have the introduction to finish, so I know what I have to do in New York these days, otherwise the publisher will kill me. But today we are here to talk about the Leopardi's theory of infinite desire. It's the topic of a book chapter that will be published probably next year or a couple of years from now. There will be a Leopardi companion published by Palgrave Macmillan. and they asked me to contribute, and this is a topic that I have addressed several times in small articles written for Italian journals, popular magazines. You know, it's something that Italians are always curious to know about Leopardi's Teoria del Piacere. But then I wanted to expand it, and so this is the chapter that I have written. It's much longer than what is allowed in a presentation, so I will cut a lot of parts. But I hope I can get to the core of the issue, which is the pleasure theory, or the theory of desire in Leopardi, is one of the most vital contribution that he gave to Italian and European philosophy in the 19th century. Of course, nobody knew that until Zibaldone was published in 1898. That was the first edition, and nobody really absorbed what Leopardi had to say on the topic until the 1920s, 30s, and I would say right now, because the work on the Zibaldone is never finished. Now that we have the English translation edited by Franco Dintino and Michael Caesar, of course that's a great help for everybody who works on Leopardi in the Anglo-Saxon environment, because finally we have what we were talking about for 100 years, and it was not available, and our colleagues could not understand us. Theory of desire and pleasure are strictly related in Leopardi, and I have to how can I say, to make a disclaimer. That is, I am a Leopardista, yes, but I am not affected by Leopardolatria. That is, I do not think that Leopardi was always right. I do not think that everything he said is absolutely cast in stone and we have to take it absolutely at face value. Because Leopardi's thought is constantly in progress. What Leopardi says in 1820 may be different from what he says in 1821, 22, 23, 25, or 1830. Some things remain the same, and some themes are recurring, like, for example, pleasure and desire. But every time Leopardi comes back to them, he does not merely repeat what he has already said. It adds something. It may seem little, but when you look at the recurrence of the same topic in the pages of the Zibaldone, and then you include, of course, the Canti, Operette Morali, and Pensieri, then you see that there is a development that was unfortunately interrupted by his early death at the age of 39. But that is why we should resist the tendency that I've seen in several articles and books on Leopardi that I've read, to take maybe the first years of the Zibaldone, 1818, 1820, 1821, as the definitive word that Leopardi has to say on that subject. No, usually it's not like that. It's not definitive. Nothing is really definitive in Leopardi. We have to follow him, just like he followed his train of thought. And the same thing, that applies to the ideas of pleasure and desire. However, before I start the academic part of my presentation, I would like to introduce you to the list of characters that I'm going to talk about. And of course, the first one is Giacomo Leopardi. And then you may have a surprise, because the second character is Marquis de Sade, which I think no one has ever thought of connecting to Leopardi, but you will see that my idea may be a little far off, but not too far off. And then we have Edmund Burke, because Leopardi read the philosophical inquiry on the nature of beautiful and sublime of Edmund Burke, and that had an effect on him. Goethe, because there are some similarities between the theory of pleasure and desire in Leopardi and the essential topic of desire in Faust. And then we come to modernity, so we have Sigmund Freud, unavoidable, and after Sigmund Freud there will be a couple of words on Jacques Lacan, who's the current philosopher of desire, the philosopher of desire of our times, and a little bit of Gilles Deleuze to complement Lacan, because it's not possible to read Leopardi and the theory of pleasure in Leopardi with Lacanian glasses without taking Deleuze into account. There must be, you know, a more balanced view. And then, of course, because the title was what it was, I have the Rolling Stones as well. They must not be underestimated in terms of the theory of desire. Well, as I told you, Leopardi died when he was 39 years old, and therefore he never fully experienced what Melanie Klein calls the melancholia of mature age, of adulthood, which, according to her, one does not reach before he is or she is over 40. But he experienced the melancholia of the young man. There is a wonderful essay by Walter Benjamin, in fact, on Leopardi's Pensieri, in which Benjamin pinpoints exactly, you know, the kind of Benjamin was an expert in the study of melancholia. He wrote very important things on the subject, and in a short review of Leopardi's Pensieri, the German translation, he says exactly what is needed to say about the melancholia of the young man, melancholy of the young man. In fact, this is a common approach to Leopardi, and I don't want to miss it, of course, because there's no way you can escape Leopardi's bleakness when he deals with this theme. But I would like to point out that Leopardi is trying, especially in his early years, when he starts the Baldone in 1818, but especially in the year 2021 up to 23, he really wants to be. He would like to be a philosopher, but at the same time he is a poet, and he cannot forget that side of him. That creates a very interesting parallel motion, because on the one hand he wants to be a serious philosopher who addresses nature in materialistic and sensualist terms. On the other hand, as a poet, he cannot fail to address nature as a living organism. So on the one hand, as a poet, he comes from the Platonic and Renaissance tradition of seeing nature as a living organism. The greatest representative was late Renaissance and Baroque, was Giordano Bruno. On the other hand, as a philosopher, his readings are, of course, you know, Enlightenment, French philosophy of the 18th century. And on the one hand, you have the Pierre Bayle, Fontenelle, Montesquieu, D'Alembert, Voltaire, and especially the ideologue, I would say Helvetius, Condillac, and one who is less known, Constantin de Volney. In many ways, you can say that Leopardi is the only ideologue or ideologue that Italian culture has ever produced, because that is really his school of reference. But then there is Rousseau. And Rousseau complicates the picture, because if you have a very sensualist and materialistic view of the world in the authors that I have just quoted, that I just mentioned, then there is the philosophy of feeling in Rousseau. And this is the one that complicates everything, because from the philosophy of feeling in Rousseau, especially I would say La Nouvelle Héloïse, because that's where you can find something, a theory of pleasure that is very similar to what Leopardi explains. Then you have this dichotomy. So nature on the one hand is a mechanism, and on the other hand is a person. And as much as we conceive of nature as an individuality, as a person, as a she, in fact, at the same time we feel not only nature, but we feel a certain kind of affection or disaffection toward nature that structures our ideas of what pleasure and desires are. So the Leopardi comes to, starts with the conclusion, so to speak. It does not start with the research. It starts with the conclusion that everybody is unhappy. That is not the conclusion of a research. It is his starting point. Everybody is unhappy, and this is not a chance occurrence. It is an absolute certainty. If something thinks the opposite, it's because he, she, or it is under the delusion of a fleeting pleasure. So the idea, the wisdom of unhappiness, we can call it like this, is not the result of a life process. No, it's the very foundation of everything that comes after. And so Leopardi comes to it because he feels it, not because he has started with the demonstration. Then he will proceed and try to demonstrate this assumption. But at the beginning is in fact an assumption based on feeling that you can find in this quote that dates back to 12-23 July 1820. This is the moment, July 1820 is when Leopardi falls into his reflection on what pleasure is and what desire is. And he starts with this great opening, the sense of nothingness of all things, the inadequacy of each and every pleasure to fill our spirit. And that is the beginning, you know, and you can go to the end of the quote. This desire and this tendency has no limits, because it is inborn or born along with existence itself, and so cannot reach its end in this or that pleasure, which cannot be infinite, but will end only when life ends. This is the assumption. The assumption is that we are moved toward an infinite desire by the sense, he could say also feeling, of the nothingness of all things. Everything Leopardi says after that is a variation after variation, and sometimes it's a clarification or a complication, but the assumption, in fact, does not change. That pleasure may be finite and contingent, and desire is infinite by nature. And this is a betrayal of happiness. That is why we cannot be happy. It is, and here comes his attempt to logicize what he has just said. This is a logical contradiction in the heart of being. This is what Leopardi is trying to demonstrate from 1820 to 1824 every time he comes back to the topic of pleasure in the Zibaldone. We have to understand that he started from a very scholastic point of view, because his philosophical education before he started reading, you know, the Enlightenment authors was strictly scholastic. His preceptor, Don Sebastiano Sanchini, was one of his two preceptors that he had, was a Jesuit and was trained in scholasticism. So of course, you know, that is how Aristotle came to Leopardi. And then, of course, also in Thomas Aquinas, you find that the search for the desire for beatitudo is infinite. Of course, in Thomas Aquinas, the search and the desire for beatitudo will find its final harbor in the love of God. But if you take God out of the picture, and Leopardi starts taking God out of the picture when he begins reading, you know, Voltaire, D'Alembert, and Rousseau, and so on and so forth, then what you have is a principle of infinite pleasure that has no longer has an end. It is really infinite, literally infinite. And this is what he writes, for example, on April 5, 1824. If a man could feel infinitely, or of whatever kind the sensation was, provided it was not unpleasurable, he would be happy in that moment, because the feeling is so keen, and such keenness, not the pleasure in itself, is pleasurable for man in itself, of whatever kind it is. So a man would feel in that moment an infinite pleasure, and that sensation would be an infinite pleasure. Yes, but therefore perfect, but it would last only one moment. However, the point is that Leopardi posits an absolute equivalence between pleasure and happiness. That is the first thing we have to be aware of, you know, because it may be one of the weak points in his argument, that this assumption that pleasure and happiness are absolutely the same thing. In fact, you know, despite the romantic overtone of such a declaration, the rationalism, utilitarianism of 18th century psychology and social theory also is all there, for which, you know, for all utilitarianism and the social theory of the 18th century, the immense debate on happiness that was going on in French culture, le bonheur, one of the great subjects of the 18th century. You know, it was based on the assumption that whatever humans do, they do it to increase their welfare. And that was an assumption that was never questioned, not in the 18th century. And in fact, it found its way in the American Declaration of Independence. The pursuit of happiness comes directly from the debate on le bonheur in France. Now, after the French Revolution, which was, after all, a revolution pour le bonheur, the revolutionaries, they were really convinced they were bringing happiness to the people. And when they saw that that was not exactly the case, in Europe, the theme of happiness practically disappeared from the political discourse. Immanuel Kant came and said, no, you know, political happiness is basically a contradiction in terms. There's no such thing. It remained in the American Declaration of Independence. In Leopardi, because, you know, his readings are 30 years late or 40 years late, because he relied on the library of his father, and the library of his father was huge, and there was a lot of things, but some very recent things were just not there. So he reads Rousseau, he reads Helvétius, Condillac, and to him there are his readings. They are present to the moment that he reads them. So he reads them not in an historical way, but in a more oracular way. You know, they are talking to him in that very moment. It is 1820 or 1825. The rest of Europe is talking about different things, but he's stuck up in Recanati. So what can you expect? So he takes this issue seriously, and to him they are absolutely contemporary, to the point that in fact he comes to anticipate the things that were going to be said 70 years later. You know, that's the virtue of being non-contemporary with your time. You can be belated in your time, but you can anticipate the future. So the point in Leopardi is that he tries to match his scholastic upbringing with the philosophy of feeling in Rousseau and the materialism of the ideologue. That's not an easy task. Because he never read Immanuel Kant, so he never read one of the early writings of Kant, 1764, Annotation on the Sublime, you know, many years before Kant addressed the same issue in the Critical Judgment. However, in 1764, Kant had already stated very clearly against the philosophy of feeling, which he admired in Rousseau, but he did not admire in the English writer that he read, Hutchison and Shaftesbury and others, that if you feel that something is true, that doesn't make it true. It seems a very simple thing to say, but Kant needed to say that because the philosophy of feeling was becoming more and more, you know, encompassing everything else. That is how Kant saw the influence of English moralists. Leopardi has no notion of that. So to him, feeling equals truth. If I feel something very intensely, in a way or another, it must be true. If I feel that everybody is unhappy, in a way or another, that must be true. And this is very inaccurate from the philosophical point of view, but it is very accurate according to the tenets of literary romanticism, because this is how literary romanticism operates. Nietzsche, many years later, was the one who described, in fact, the romantic mind precisely as the mind that takes seriously what Kant would call subjective universality. That is, what I feel must be what everybody else feels. And this is what Nietzsche wrote. The real romantic is the one who suffers deeply, who struggles, is tortured, and who would like to stamp as a binding law the real idiosyncrasy of his suffering by forcing, imprinting, branding his image on them, all things, the image of his torture. And he's thinking of Leopardi too. He's thinking of Hölderlin, basically, but he's also thinking of Leopardi. But Leopardi, as a romantic, is kind of reluctant, is a reluctant romantic. He feels intensely, and he wants to expand his feeling to all mankind, but feeling is not enough for him. He wants to demonstrate logically that everybody is unhappy. So he has to go back to Aristotle, and he has to attack the main point in Aristotle, which is the principle of non-contradiction, Metaphysics, Book 4. So what he finds is that there is also the Ethica here, the Ethica Nicomachea. So Aristotle says that all beings strive toward their perfection. Well, very, very good, but that does mean, what it means is that creatures, beings, whatever beings, not just human creatures, animals, plants, even stones, Leopardi probably could suffer, they are generated or come into the world in a state of imperfection, and therefore they have to strive toward their perfection, and the perfection will coincide with happiness. So the entelecheia, so to speak, will coincide with beatitudo, may I say. Well, if really Aristotle says that, Aristotle is in contradiction with himself, or maybe Aristotle is not in contradiction with himself, but then again, being itself is in contradiction with itself. Leopardi does not believe in the original sin, and therefore he cannot account for the imperfection of creatures, blaming it on the original sin. If creatures are born imperfect, they will strive toward their perfection, but that will mean that they will be unhappy for the rest of their lives. That is the demonstration. That is the demonstration because, and the question is, but why are we born imperfect? Why are not we born in a state of perfection? Why do we have to go through this entire life of imperfection and therefore unhappiness, pain, sorrow, grief, without even be sure that we can reach our entelecheia, our finality, and therefore our happiness? In fact, we never reach it. So we are sentenced by the very contradictory structure of being to a permanent unhappiness. And this is a thinking that will torment Leopardi until 1825, when he will formulate it in the most simple and clearest possible manner. But of course, we have to say that such line of reasoning is also a little bit too formalistic, too deductive. Because are we so sure that the finality coincides with happiness? Aren't we mixing up ontology and ethics when we do this? Leopardi does not ask this question, does not ask this question to himself. And I think this is the impact of the philosophy of feeling on him, because in the end, what we are is what we feel, and therefore, if we strive for a certain finality, that finality must coincide with the state of mind, and the state of mind must be happiness. As long as we do not reach our ontological finality, we are also unhappy. This is highly debatable, of course. It is highly debatable because it is a conflation of ontology and ethics. And this is probably the weak point in Leopardi's argument. He is not very subtle on this point. But we also have to keep in mind that Leopardi switches constantly from the logical discourse to the poetic discourse, and from the deductive mode of reasoning to the oracular or poetic mode of expressing his thought. And therefore, his proposition, even when aspire to be logical, are in fact oracular and dogmatic. They are. They are, because they are ultimately poetic. In the end, what kind of knowledge he is striving for? He is striving for a knowledge that does not really separate philosophy from poetry. And that is why that we have this conflation of ethics and ontology and psychology in a way. This is a metaphysical psychology that is aiming to. If we understand Leopardi's struggle to get to a notion of happiness and unhappiness, that is both. There are three sides, ontological, ethical, and psychological, then we can make the jump to Freud and Freud's metapsychology. He called it like that. He called it metapsychology, beginning with 1920 when he wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and then The Ego and the Id in 1923. Well, and here also we see the first cracks in the building that Leopardi was trying to build. You know, he is absolutely sure between 1820, 1824, he's absolutely certain that his mix of ontology, ethics, and psychology can work. Then we will see that he's no longer so assured about that. That is why we can make the jump to Freud and his book Beyond the Pleasure Principle, when Freud introduces the notion of that drive. I will not spend too much time on it because otherwise we would be lost. But what I want to say is that Freud practically brings to an end 2,000 years of philosophy of pleasure and philosophy of happiness. Up to Freud, no one, except Nietzsche and, as we will see, maybe Leopardi, no one had really challenged the notion that we always strive for our welfare. That was a given. It was a given in, especially at the birth of capitalism. It was a given in positivism at the end of the 18th century. And Freud destroys that idea, the idea that whatever we do it for our happiness. Because he introduces the notion of that drive, which is the resistance of our ego to too many inputs from outside, and the desire of the ego to go to death naturally. So he posits a dualistic metaphysics in which on the one side we have eros, we have eroticism that conquers, that wants to reproduce, that goes out in the world. And on the other hand, we have the ego drive. And the ego drive is the ones who say, no, don't do that. Don't do that. I want to be quiet. I want to die quiet. It's a brutal simplification, but I hope it works. So, at the first glance, Leopardi looks like he's absolutely monolithic, on the side of whatever we do it for our happiness. The real problem with when we say that, and especially we understand it after Freud, is that this kind of theory is self-fulfilling. If you say whatever we do it for our happiness, there is no way you can falsify this theory. You can say, well, I know somebody who committed suicide. Well, but he did it because he was unhappy, so he killed himself in order to be happy. I know someone else who ruined his life by gambling. Well, maybe gambling was his form of happiness. Okay, but that is a dead end. In the end, a theory of pleasure on the theory of happiness that relies on this monolithical assumption, and this is a problem that you have when you study how many Leopardi scholars have addressed the issue. They totally believe everything Leopardi says, even though in their normal life, in the 20th or 21st century, you cannot live like that. You cannot really think that whatever you do it for your happiness. Things have changed. But when they read Leopardi, they fall into the Leopardi pit, and they never get out. But I don't want to disparage Leopardi, absolutely not. He had pinpointed a very serious issue. He was trying to get out. He was trying to get out. Maybe he did not have the time entirely to get out, but he tried. The fact is that in the first phase of this theory, as I told you, it is not falsifiable. If somebody would raise his hand and say to Leopardi, well, but I am reasonably happy, can you disprove that? Leopardi would say, no, you cannot be reasonably happy because you're still alive. You have not reached the final point of your life. Therefore, you are not perfect. Therefore, you cannot be reasonably happy. If you are reasonably happy, that means that you are reasonably unhappy. Should we drop the entire thing? No, no, not at all. Not at all. But not before we unveil the hidden treasure that lies at the bottom of Leopardi's Sea of Desire, l'Infinito, for example. We must complete our parsed instruments. So the high redundancy and the low level of information of the first phase of this theory of desire is the main issue. It's expressed in a beautiful prose, of course. You know, it's a masterful prose. It seems that it tells more than it says. There is a high redundancy, a beautiful style, but there is a low level of information. In fact, the proof is if we try to falsify it really, if we really try to falsify Leopardi's theory of pleasure, we have to turn it upside down. And we see that if Leopardi, for example, had said that human beings are obsessed with a desire not for happiness but for grief, that nature has created them so that they cannot but desire the greatest possible sorrow. No matter what decision they make, their only goal is to increase their suffering and other people's suffering, and therefore the search for an impossible, unlimited happiness is nature's stratagem to push us toward the infinite pain of an infinite disappointment. Well, the theory of Leopardi would remain absolutely the same. It would not change a bit. Only that if we say such a thing, we are not reading Leopardi. We are reading Marquis de Sade. The theory of pain in Marquis de Sade, which is as absolute as the theory of pleasure in Leopardi. Or we may be reading Jacques Lacan's essay, Kant avec Sade. Kant avec Sade, in which he shows in his own funny way that the ethics of Kant is not entirely different from the distorted ethics of de Sade. I will not go into that, of course, at the moment, but we can speak of Leopardi avec Sade in this case. And instead of a search for pleasure, we would be speaking of a search for jouissance. That is the term that Jacques Lacan uses to indicate excessive pleasure, pleasure bordering with pain, pleasure that includes pain, or pain that includes pleasure. Of course, it's difficult to translate jouissance because in French it has many uses, and some of them are perfectly innocuous. Lacan gave the word this particular slant. If you translate it in English, you translate it with enjoyment. But it's not enough. Enjoyment is not as strong as jouissance. In fact, sometimes I prefer to translate it with thrill. Thrill gives you a better idea, When a couple of years ago, when I explained this idea to my students at the University of Houston, I had a student who was a former Marine, and he told me, I understand perfectly what you mean, because when I was in the Army, and I was interviewed together with other young men who wanted to become Marines, and some of them had the question, why do you want to become a Marine? They answered, to defy death, which is the classic, I would say the classic definition of death drive. The classic definition of death drive is to defy death. I become a Marine because I know that I will risk my life every day to defy death. That's jouissance, absolutely. It's not pleasure. This is not a search for pleasure. It's a search for excessive pleasure. It's a search for infinite pleasure. And infinite pleasure, because it's infinite, includes all the possible pain. So when we read the infinite desire in Leopardi, we have to read between the lines. We have to read between the lines and understand that if pleasure is infinite, it will include pain. Pain cannot be left out. And so maybe Leopardi's theory of pleasure is actually a théorie de jouissance avant la lettre, a theory of jouissance, of enjoyment, of thrill, that he had, formulated in some way many years before this term would be popularized by Lacan and the hordes of Lacanians that now are invading the world. know, when we read in Leopardi something like that, it follows from material pleasure that man and any living being, even at the moment of the greatest pleasure of their life, want not only more, but infinitely more than they have, that is greater pleasure to infinity. And an infinitely greater pleasure, because they always want infinite happiness and therefore infinite pleasure. A chill runs down our spine, because, I don't know if you're familiar with the 120 Days of Sodom, Marquis de Sade again, but these could be the words of the Lord d'Orsay. Lord d'Orsay is the character in the Sade who is obsessed by, he hates Mother Nature, just like Leopardi did. He hates Mother Nature, but for an opposite reason that is not so opposite. Leopardi hated Mother Nature because Mother Nature is a cruel stepmother, because she promises what she cannot give us, pleasure and happiness. D'Orsay blames Mother Nature because Mother Nature has given him an infinite imagination to conceive infinite crimes, but not the physical means to perform them. So what bothers the Marquis de Sade's torturer is that there is a limit to pleasure, and the limit is the death of the victim. The victim dies only once. I don't know if you remember in Pasolini's Salò, the 120 Days of Sodom, there is the monologue of D'Orsay is there, is in the film, and it's the moment when one of the lords says to the victims, "You don't know that I would like to kill you 1,000 times." Unfortunately, he cannot. You know? So there is a limit to infinite pleasure. There is a limit to infinite jouissance also. So, but you know, we are still stuck. We're still stuck because if Leopardi's theory of pleasure is nothing more than a fascinating but ultimately, you know, stubborn, incomplete draft, portentously lacking in subtlety, and bordering, you know, with psychosis in many ways, well, then it would not be much different from I would say, teenager wisdom. The teenager wisdom that puts on the T-shirt, life sucks, and then you die. You know, what would be the difference? The difference between Leopardi's theory of pleasure and life sucks, and then you die. There would be no difference at all. So we have to go a little deeper into the matter. We have to wait until April 1825, Leopardi is almost 27 years old, to spot a few cracks in the fortress of his solitude. These times, his new line of reasoning starts because he is reading Constantin de Volney, who was one of the ideologues, not very read today. He wrote a massive volume called La Loi Naturelle, but Volney was extremely important at the beginning of the 19th century. He is one of the main sources, you'll be surprised, but he's one of the main sources of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The Loi Naturelle, the natural law in Volney, is one of the sources, you know, for the creation of the monster and the fact that the monster has an ethics. You know, is the natural law incarnated, embodied. However, this is an aside. Volney says that pleasure is not really the principal and the immediate object of our existence. Oh, no more than pain is. These are the words of Volney. Pleasure, if taken beyond need, brings self-destruction. Pain sometimes ensures survival. So Leopardi starts thinking about that because, you know, that is a crack in his theory. It's a crack in his theory. So his theory is not as solid as he thought it was. And he still insists on a purely deductive demonstration. And in fact, probably as a reaction to what he read in Volney, he writes down the most perfect statement about the contradiction in being that he had found some years before. This is the definitive formulation of that. An evident, it's one of the most famous pages in the Zibaldone, an evident and undeniable contradiction in the order of things and in the mode of their existence, a terrifying contradiction, but not for that reason any less true. A great mystery, which can never be explained unless we deny, according to my system he had, laid down years before, every absolute truth and falsity, and abandon, in a certain sense, the very principle of our understanding, non potest idem simul esse et non esse. The same thing cannot be and not be at the same time, which is a different formulation of the principle of non-contradiction. So, after reading Volney, after understanding that Volney implicitly criticizes his deductive line of reasoning, he wants to formulate his deductive line of reasoning in the most clear and perfect way that is possible to him. And he will not proceed further than that. But one interesting thing in this quote is that Leopardi acknowledges in a way, not just in this quote, but in the next notes of the Di Baldone, that in fact pain is important. Pain has a role in our self-preservation. This is something that you could get from Rousseau. It's the difference from the amour de soi, self-love, and amour propre. Amour de soi is survival, instinct of survival. But Leopardi does not think that this is an instinct. He thinks that it is a line of reasoning. He calls it a line of reasoning. And then we have amour propre, which may bring you to satisfy even a part of your body for pride. For pride, I mean, you as a soldier can decide to lose an arm because you want to finish a battle, because you want to acquire glory and pride. So you are ready to suffer pain. You are not looking for your bonheur in that moment. You are ready to suffer pain because your amour propre is your happiness. So you see, he is trying to develop a more complex theory at this point. And it is, in fact, not a coincidence that Leopardi, in the following year, in 1826, will come to write, the Cantico del Gallo Silvestre, the Song of the Wild Rooster. Later it includes in the Operette Morali, where that basically says, yes, we are. It appears that to die is the only object of the essence of things, not to be perfect, no longer to be perfect, but to die. To die. Things are born so that they can die. Freud said the same thing in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Differences aside, see, it's indeed striking to compare Freud's statement. The aim of all life is death. It's the ego drive, the death drive, the ego drive. Beyond the Pleasure Principle, with Leopardi's Cantico del Gallo Silvestre. It appears that to die is the only object or the essence of things. Leopardi advances, 2 steps and then goes back 1. He is not ready to accept completely the existence of a death drive for which he has no name, of course. So he stubbornly insists again in April 1825 that there's no other principle except one's own happiness and therefore pleasure. So it looks like he has opened the door and then he has closed it again, but not entirely, because the terrifying contradiction that Leopardi has spotted is not inside being. No, not this time. I mean, if you read the entire notes, you understand that. It's between the individual drive and nature's drive. So the contradiction is no longer inside an ontological structure, perfect and self-sufficient, but it's among forces, different forces. The force of the individual, the drive of the individual, and the forces of nature. But they are both destructive. They both have, we may say, sadistic components, because they aim at the destruction of the love object or even of themselves. But they are 2 different ways of approaching self-destruction, because the self-destruction of the individual is forever. Self-destruction of nature is to be reborn. So yes, there is a contradiction, but the contradiction is now between one complete and definitive finality, the individual will die and that will be the end of it, and the nature constant process of dying. Nature dies all the time, but dies all the time because nature is moved by her own particular drive, which is not this or that creature, but her own jouissance, the jouissance to die and be reborn constantly. That leaves the individual completely hopeless. The two drives, the two forces cannot be reconciled. That is the ultimate contradiction. It's no longer inside the Aristotelian notion of being. It's a much more modern interpretation of an incompatibility at the core of our existence, if not being. So you see, Leopardi, by reaffirming reaffirming the lexicon of utilitarianism, of social theory of 18th century, even of Rousseau, he has in fact shattered their foundation. When the compulsion to repeat or that drive overcomes the pleasure principle, the search for the greatest pleasure is indistinguishable from the search for the greatest pain. And Leopardi does not clearly distinguish between the two paths, but he has glimpsed what makes them so different and so close at the same time. And that is why we can open Leopardi's theory of pleasure to another connection. First, let me say that we can describe it like that. We can say that Leopardi's theory of pleasure and of infinite desire is not an anatomy of melancholy. It's not, one of he's not coming back to the issue of melancholia, or as it was in the Renaissance, or even in the 18th century, because there was a huge literature on melancholia in the 18th century, medical literature also. He is not doing that. Now he's not looking back anymore. He's looking forward. He doesn't know where. He doesn't know where he's going, but he's looking forward. His treatment now of the theory of pleasure is almost a handbook for aspiring warriors. Warriors in the name of strive. Strive and strive and strive. To what? Well, strive against nature, because there's no other strife. Strife is against nature. Is to get from nature everything we can, although we know that it will be very little. And that is the strive of Faust. That is the core of Faust. But let me tell you one thing more before we go to Faust. What was the state of the current theory of pleasure apart from social theory, apart from the authors that we have mentioned, the ideologue and others, the sensualist, the materialist? What other people were thinking about the nature of pleasure? Well, you can read Montaigne, you can read John Locke, or even an Italian philosopher contemporary to Giacomo Leopardi, Pietro Verri, the Discorso sull'indole del piacere e del dolore, Discourse on Nature, Pleasure and Pain, which had quite a circulation, and you find that they have something in common. Pleasure is always a negative pleasure. That is, pleasure is absence of pain. That's the common wisdom. We strive for pleasure, but actually we strive for an absence of pain. That was the most common definition that you could find of pleasure in the literature of 17th century and 18th century. Even Freud, for a while, subscribed to this notion, because it was reaffirmed by some physiologists at the end of the 19th century. Fechner, for example. And pleasure corresponds to an increase in the quantity of excitation, and pleasure to diminution. It's Freud's description of sexual orgasm. It's not the excitation that is pleasurable, it's the afterward, the aftermath. It's when the excitation goes down. So pleasure is a constant state of low excitation. There was, however, only one author who challenged this notion, the notion of negative pleasure, and this author is Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke, in his Philosophical Inquiry of 1757, which is not here, it is here. In 1857, translated into Italian in 1804, and Leopardi, in his father's library, there was a copy of the translation, Carlo Ercolani. And this is, for example, what Burke is saying about his criticism, his critique of the negative pleasure. For if, previous to the pain, I do not feel any actual pleasure, I have no reason to judge that any such thing exists, since pleasure is only pleasure as it is felt. So if I have no notion of positive pleasure, how can I know that I am experiencing pleasure? Just because the pain went down, but I don't know that this is pleasure, because I never felt it on the positive side. So there must be such thing as positive pleasure. And in fact, Burke proceeds to describe different things of positive pleasure, positive and negative, but not of the kind as Locke and others were saying. In a way, when Leopardi writes La quiete dopo la tempesta, the calm after the storm, he puts into poetry what Burke was saying, because you have here, O gentle nature, these are what you give us. These are the delights you offer mortals. Surcease from suffering is happiness for us. This is the theory of negative pleasure. But in Leopardi, it's very clear that he's making a critique of negative pleasure. He's not accepting it as a given. He's saying, well, this is what you, nature, this is what you do. You force us to believe that the only happiness is absence of pain. Surcease from suffering is happiness for us. Actually, in Italian, Leopardi says that is repetition, and the repetition is important. O natura cortese, sono questi i doni tuoi. Questi i diletti sono, che tu porgi ai mortali, uscir di pena è diletto fra noi. So the word diletto appears twice. And the translator, Jonathan Galassi, probably wanted to avoid the repetition, and so first he used delights and then happiness. However, I think that delight here is the key word, because delight is the same word that Edmund Burke uses for negative pleasure. So when you speak of negative pleasure, the absence of pain, he calls it delight. Otherwise, he calls it pleasure. I don't know, because I had not the opportunity to look at the Ercolani translation of 1804, if Ercolani translates delight with diletto or not. I know that we cannot make a big thing out of it, because Leopardi uses diletto and felicità as synonyms many times. So I cannot really say that he had Burke in mind when he wrote this line, and you have absolutely to use the word delight, because that's the word used by Burke, or maybe diletto by his translator. I cannot say that. However, the coincidence is interesting. Well, however, if you overcome the notion of pleasure as negative pleasure, and you say, okay, this is delight, but pleasure is something else. Pleasure is always excessive in a way. If it is not excessive, it's delight. If it is excessive, it's pleasure, but of course that will include the notion of jouissance. However, who is, as I told you before, the hero of infinite desire and infinite positive pleasure, if not Faust? And is it possible that Leopardi had any notion of Faust? Leopardi had some notion of Goethe, that's for sure. He read Werther, but of course everybody read Werther. He read some excerpts from Goethe's autobiography, Dichtung und Wahrheit, Poetry and Truth, which appeared when he was living in Florence. They appeared on the Antologia. Some chapters have been translated, and he wrote a letter to his brother, to Carlo Leopardi, saying that he had been very much impressed by Goethe's autobiography, although there is always a resistance on part of Leopardi, for everything that comes from the German world. It's a strong cultural and political resistance. After all, the Austrians were the oppressors, in northern Italy, and there were, every time that he spent in Milan or in other parts, he had Austrian spies following him. Sometimes informers of the Austrian police were his best friends. And it happened. He never knew that, but it happened. And so, of course, there is a strong resistance on the part of Leopardi and other Italian intellectuals to anything that comes from the German world. So when he speaks positively about Goethe, he says, I was very impressed, but I cannot read that stuff. It's too Gothic for me. I don't really like it. I don't know all this obscurity, this Gothicism. Well, Goethe is not particularly Gothic in his autobiography, but of course, you know, to an Italian mentality at the time, probably yes, that was the impression. However, what about Faust? Faust was translated in Italy for the first time by Giovita Scalvini in 1835, but Leopardi was already in Naples at the time, and I don't think he had any occasion to see drafts of the translation. Although Scalvini moved from Paris to Florence all the time, but I don't think that Leopardi had the opportunity to see drafts of Scalvini's translation. Besides, in the last years of his life, Leopardi was severely affected by glaucoma, and there's not much that he could read. You know, he had other people reading things to him because he had basically to stop reading, except for a few moments a day in the last years of his life. So a direct knowledge of Faust, I think, should be excluded. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because we have the texts, and the texts speak for themselves. His theory of pleasure, you know, predates, by the way, every knowledge that he could have had of Faust. And when we read in 1829 a quote like this from the Zibaldone, we cannot but think of Goethe's character, you know. For any degree of well-being, however great, by which the living being was not satisfied, would not be happiness, nor would it be true well-being, and vice versa. Any degree of good, however small, by which the living being was satisfied, would be a state that was perfectly fitting to that being's nature, and a state that was happy. Now, contentment with one's way of being is incompatible with self-love. For the living being always of necessity desires a better state, a greater degree of good. That is why happiness is impossible in nature and by its own nature. But it is not impossible to strive for it. In fact, you cannot do but that. You cannot but strive, because your self-love is the one that will make you strive for it. So, whom is Leopardi addressing here? I don't think he's addressing the playful boy of the Sabato del Villaggio. I think he's creating a titanic figure for himself and for everyone else who wants to follow him. So he comes to the status of a sort of a little Faust from the Italian provinces, I would say. And in fact, if we again quote from Freud, who never read Leopardi, but Freud knew Goethe very well, this is what he has to say about Faust. And it's not that different from what Leopardi is saying. The repressed instinct never ceases to strive for complete satisfaction, which would consist in the repetition of a primary experience of satisfaction. No substitutive or reactive formation, no sublimation will suffice to remove the repressed instinct's persisting tension. And it is the difference in amount between the pleasure of satisfaction which is demanded and that which is actually achieved that provides the driving factor which will permit of no halting in any position, at any position attained, but, in the poet's words, presses ever forward, unsubdued. And of course the quote is from Faust. To conclude, today maybe we are no longer interested in happiness that much. It has slipped away from our discourse. Anyone who would dare to introduce today a politics of happiness would be probably laughed about. But happiness was an ethical ideal, and as such, it is a pity that we have lost it. We are obsessed by other things. We are obsessed with our desires, our enjoyments, most of all by the constant search for a thrill, I would say, without which we do not feel alive, you know. I want to become a Marine to defy death. We go back to that. So we are not far from thinking that happiness is in fact the greatest obstacle to the expansion of desire, because happiness is the end of desire. If we are happy, we don't desire anymore, and we want to desire. We don't want to stop our desiring, or we don't want to stop musing and writing and philosophizing about our desires. According, for example, to Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, they are speaking of courtly love here, but their line of reasoning applies. For example, love that endlessly defers its fulfillment stands for, and I quote, an achieved state in which desire no longer lacks anything, but fills itself and constructs its own field of immanence. In other words, this field is not internal to the ego, it's not an ego drive. In fact, it does not depend on ego or non-ego. It's out there. It is, I quote again, like the absolute outside that knows no self or selves, because interior and exterior are equally a part of the immanence in which they have fused. That is why the slightest caress may be as strong as an orgasm. An orgasm is nothing but an unpleasant accident interrupting the flow of desire. If pleasure is not the norm of desire, it is not by virtue of a lack that is impossible to fill, but on the contrary, by virtue of its positivity. In other words, the plane of consistency it draws in the course of its process. This is Deleuze-Guattari. Of course, there's a big difference between the theory of desire in Deleuze-Guattari and the theory of desire in Lacan. The major difference is that in Lacan we desire because we are incomplete, because we are split from the start. You know, the contradiction within inside of being, so to speak. Lacan has reformulated it in a more current fashion, but it's still the same thing. We were born split. The moment we have access to language, we are split. We are no longer natural. You know. I'm simplifying. I hope there are no Lacanians here because they could kill me, but I need to come to the conclusion. To Deleuze-Guattari, on the other hand, desire is strange to this extent that it's not the result of a lack. It's not the result of something that is missing. Desire is productive. Desire is a constant production. A production that, just like nature in Leopardi, wants to produce and produce and produce and produce. And that's why desire is infinite. Not because desire wants something. Desire wants nothing. Desire wants itself and nothing else. And in fact, you know, the slightest caress is like an orgasm. Even an orgasm may not be that great because it interrupts desire, and so on and so forth. So, if for Lacan the real is always impossible, that is, a desire that can never be satisfied, for Deleuze and Guattari, the impossible is always real. Desire, we might say, lacks nothing to produce and reproduce itself. It is supremely indifferent. And if what matters about desire is only that its flow never stops, then Leopardi's theory of pleasure does incline toward Lacan, impossibility of satisfaction, and at the same time it inclines toward Deleuze and Guattari. Satisfaction is irrelevant. In fact, when Leopardi speaks of the pure desire for pleasure, you know what is the pure desire for pleasure in Leopardi? It's boredom. When you desire nothing, but you desire nothing, you experience boredom. And boredom, the theory of boredom in Leopardi, in a way, it's much more interesting than his theory of pleasure. That would be another occasion, you know. Because Leopardi is the first one who recognizes that boredom is a passion. He calls it a passion. And as a passion, it is intense. It is not just idleness. It is something that not everybody can really experience boredom. Boredom is a very strong passion because it's desire in its pure state. When desire desires itself, and desires itself because desires has acknowledged that not even the universe is as big enough for desire. Universe is a disappointment. Desire is bigger than the universe. The desire for pleasure has no limits because it belongs, this is Leopardi, in 1820. He had already understood everything. The desire for pleasure has no limits of extent because it belongs to the substance of ourselves, not as the desire for one or more pleasures, but as the desire for pleasure. Or we can also translate it as desire for desire. Thank you. Sì, certo, certo, certo.
Okay, thank you for such fascinating reading. And if someone wants to ask a question, Professor Carrera will be able to do that.
There are other quotes here that I could not use, but maybe they can come into the. There was this quote from a letter to Carlo Leopardi. The only pleasure that Leopardi admits he ever experienced was when he visited Torquato Tasso's tomb in Rome. A very funereal pleasure, but this is what he says. It's the only moment in his life that he was happy. Okay. Talking about the slightest caress that is like an orgasm, the poem is Amore e Morte. When it ends saying, "May I simply wait serenely for the day I lay my sleeping face on your virgin breast," the virgin breast of death. There are only two instances of bodily contact in all the canti. One is in Consalvo, when Consalvo and Elvira, their hands touch while Consalvo is dying. And the other one is here, when the poet aims to touch the virgin breast of death, which is probably the highest orgasm that he can imagine to achieve.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And not about Leopardi, but about your methodology.
Yes.
You did use Popper, but
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Can you explain to me how you organize the method of this approach?
Well, Popper comes in. I didn't quote him because I sort of took it for granted. It's a memory from my classes in philosophy of science many years ago. But of course, every time you want to organize a deductive line of reasoning, it must be open to falsification. It must be open to a counter hypothesis or a counter deduction that invalidates your main deduction. And the point of the early theory of pleasure, when Leopardi is stuck on his desire to demonstrate logically the necessary unhappiness, the problem is that the demonstration that he follows is not falsifiable. In fact, if you turn it upside down and you want to demonstrate the impossibility of not striving for pain, nothing changes. It's still the same reason. That is why I inserted Popper. But my methodology was to look for in a way it was a deconstructionist methodology here, although I do not consider myself a deconstructionist, but I was looking for the weak points. Because I think the weak points are the most interesting ones. The weak points are doors that are opening to something else. Yes?
Where does bonheur stand as a term in French and European and universal philosophy? You use it once as opposed to jouissance and other words that we have in all other languages, at least the languages I know, they do not term it by a good hour, where
Yes.
bonheur makes it immediately clear to us that it's a happy moment, a very short, limited moment. Hence, where does that family with it in the
Yes.
philosophy?
I can refer you to the studies of Corrado, I think it's Corrado Rosso, his name, because he's the one that I know that has worked more than anyone else on the idea of happiness or bonheur. Corrado Rosso, Illuminismo, felicità, dolore, and felicità vo cercando. published in 1969 and 1993. However, there are other, many other scholars who have dealt with this issue. I forgot to mention that we always have to make a distinction between désir, plaisir, and bonheur. So desire, pleasure, and happiness. Because those terms were the ones used in the, especially pleasure and happiness. They're not the same thing. Not even for the theorists of the 18th century. In fact, pleasure was understood mostly as absence of pain. So it's a state of contentedness. Happiness is much more, because happiness is an ethical project. Happiness is what society strives for. And it was debated specifically in France, because, for example, the English moralists use different terms. Shaftesbury or Hutchison, especially Shaftesbury, they speak of enthusiasm, for example. Enthusiasm as a surplus of happiness. But enthusiasm, and Kant had some issues with the notion of enthusiasm. In fact, although he understood perfectly what they meant. There's his writing on the French Revolution where he uses the notion of enthusiasm. He gets it from the Scottish school, of which he was familiar, Hume and the others, and Hutchison, Richardson, and Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury was living in Naples, by the way. Lived many, many years in Naples, like Leopardi later did, and apparently he found a lot of enthusiasm in Naples. He wrote all his things on enthusiasm while he was in Naples. So enthusiasm is a surplus of pleasure, is a surplus of happiness, but it is a political project too. Because you have to bring society to enthusiasm. The notion of enthusiasm in Shaftesbury is Platonic. It's being out of yourself, like in Ione. In fact, Kant, when he writes about the French Revolution, says, well, if there is no enthusiasm in politics, nothing happens. It's not the reason that leads politics. It's enthusiasm. If you don't have enthusiasm, you don't have anything. So that is more or less the coordinates of the discussion. Then in Italy you have Pietro Verri, of course, and his notion of piacere dolore. But Verri is not particularly original. It's interesting because he brought into the Italian discussion all these notions. It's not particularly original because basically follows the idea that the pleasure is essentially negative, is absence of pain. And yeah, it is a political project for him too. In America, it becomes, with the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness, and it's the only nation in the world that has this. Yeah, but there is a. No, sorry. Now sometimes you have to stop me when I talk. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to address the American notion of happiness. I heard a sermon was very interesting that posited that in the 18th century the word happiness was not exclusively used for the feeling of how you're.
Mm-hmm.
It's really it's a different root from the Latin-based languages, and it's related to happenstance.
Mm-hmm.
So your happiness is a happenstance that that your circumstances, and that the right to life, liberty, or the pursuit of your happenstance. So the pursuit of changing your luck, changing your own circumstances, having control over your happenstance and your circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
That this is a different, and this is something we've lost. What the real right that we were establishing and arguing for.
That's right. And also, but even if you think of the notion of bonheur, bonheur is not ecstasy. You're not in a state of ecstasy when you experience bonheur. It's really contentedness, not the kind of negative pleasure. Is more than that. Is the feeling that society has reached the level of acceptable contentedness for everybody. So it's still a political idea. Yeah. There was a question? Yes.
I wanted to see when you were talking about the inner orientation, when you philosophy on an unchallenged conception anti-Socratic polemics happen. For instance, Euripides' famous, "We know what's good, but we don't practice it." There, however, there is this issue of knowing what's good or not as an important preliminary to the whole thing. And thinking about what's presented here, it seems that in your part, this might be a very modern element of the discussion, the notion of preliminary vetting what's known and what's good for you. There is no real debate on knowing what's good, but directly a debate on pleasure, right? And I'm wondering whether this is in fact the most important element of film accepting a scientific stance, because we are no longer dealing with the issue of making between what's pleasurable. We are dealing with fantasy. We are dealing with an option. That's what pleasure.
That's in fact one of the weakest points in Leopardi, because he never really clarifies the kind of pleasure he's talking about. Pleasure to him is an absolute notion. It's a notion that is self-evident. So the search for pleasure is, what kind of pleasure are you looking for? It's social, personal, sexual, culinary, whatever. He never explains what he really means with pleasure, because he has started from the absolute, from the notion of happiness as he has inherited it, from scholasticism. But if the point is, in scholasticism, you know exactly what happiness is. If you take away God from the equation, then you have the notion, but it's an empty notion. And that is why he has to work around it constantly without defining it. But the same thing is for Faust. I mean, Faust wants in a way, even Faust's pleasure is negative, because after all, he doesn't want to be satisfied in one moment. That's the bargain with the devil. If I tell you I am happy, you will send me to hell. If one moment I say, okay, I'm content, I'm happy, you can send me to hell. I don't want to be happy. I want to strive for happiness, but I don't want to be happy. And so I don't have to clarify, I don't have to define it. In a way, this is the same thing that happens in Leopardi. Yes.
I have a rather mundane question. There was a film, an Italian film produced in 2014 about the life of Leopardi. Have you seen that film, and what are your impressions, and, based on your knowledge and your,
I kind of liked it. Yes. I don't think it's a masterpiece, but it's okay.
Did it have anything to do with Leopardi's actual, life?
Yes. I mean, there are certain moments in which you think, okay, this is a film. In other moments, it looks like a docudrama. But as a didactic enterprise, I think it's perfectly acceptable. And I know that a colleague of mine had severe criticism of that film, based on the scene in which you have a voiceover reciting L'Infinito, because it's very didactic. You see Leopardi on the Mount Tabor, and the voice of the actor reciting L'Infinito. It's the most simple choice that you can have. And she had to object to the fact that the actor does not respect the ending of the line, so it connects the ending of the line with the beginning of the other line. But I found it perfectly acceptable. I mean, when you read a poem out loud, it's not like reading it, on the page. It's a different experience. I was not disturbed by that. Yeah.
Just following on that about the film, I didn't see it. Can you say something about what she was like, sort of, when you know him personally? Was she an extrovert, introvert? Was she social? Was she interested in art?
was interested in everything. The problem is that Leopardi was disabled in many ways. I mean, we could call him disabled now. He was affected by a severe scoliosis when he was a teenager that left him almost hunchback, you know. And he was a count. He was the son of a count, and he was supposed to become, you know, the head of his family. But with that kind of anomaly, there was no way that he could fulfill any kind of social role in those years. I mean, he was the son of the Count of Recanati, and when he left home, the children of the town would throw stones at him, insulting him, and say, "Here's the hunchback of the Leopardi house." And nobody objected to that, because if you were disabled, you were a nobody. He lived his life as a nobody. Yes. Yes, because you know, that was not just the hunchback. There was a lot of other issues that accompanied him all his life. He was always sick, always. And he died probably of a heart attack at the age of 39, which is common for people who you know, have that kind of severe condition. His heart was compressed, but he was basically in pain all his life, and very alone, and very asocial. In fact, he developed some patterns of behavior that were quite asocial. He didn't want to eat with anybody else. He called it autophagia. That is, one eats by himself. He was bulimic also. He developed bulimia. Sometimes it was not pleasant to have him around. He did not wash to keep people, you know, away. And he loved women, but women did not love him, of course, you know. So it was a very unhappy life. But the amount of work that he produced in this unhappy life, and in terrible circumstances, terrible. I mean, never a penny in his pocket, really. His parents were not sending him money. His parents hated him because they wanted him to become a priest, because that was the only option for someone in his condition, and he hated the very idea. He could have become a priest very easily. He had relatives in Rome, among you know, people connected with the clergy. Could have become not even a priest, just a minor order, something that could have given a stipend. He could have attended to his study all the time that he wanted, but he hated the very idea. Yes, but he was very clear about that. He wrote a letter to his friend, a Swiss philologist, Luisa in 1826, and he said, "There are people who say that my pessimistic philosophy comes from my physical condition. This is not true. This is not true. My philosophy comes from my reading of the Bible and the Greeks, from the book of wisdom, the book of Solomon, and from the Greek poets. These are the sources of my philosophy." You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Carrera.
Thank you.